All right, let me share my screen. Does everyone see this?
Yes.
Okay, so this is our third session on mysticism and the Baha'i faith. And I wanted to start with a brief recap of where we are up into this point, since where we're going to go in the third session is directly follows from where we've just been. So we began asking a question, trying to define what is mysticism, and one way of getting at the subject is to try to at least exclude what it's not. And so we looked at the possibilities. Is it a certain kind of experience? Is it a certain set of secret doctrines? Is it some special community set apart, led by a special spiritual guide? All of which have been components of mystical practice and mystical communities throughout history, but not the way the Baha'i writings seem to define the mystical experience. Although, as we talked about in the first session, it's not that it doesn't involve some kind of special experience, which can perhaps imperfectly be described in words, but it's not about the pursuit of an experience. It's about something else. And that something else, perhaps we could provisionally say, has something to do with the dynamic process of the soul drawing closer to God. But if we take that as a preliminary definition of what mysticism is and what the mystical path is, of course, it begs the question of, well, what do you mean by soul and what do you mean by God? So we spent session 2 talking mostly about concepts of God, and we'll spend this session talking about the concept of the soul. So both poles of this relationship, looking at it a little more closely, mainly through the lens of the Baha'i writings. And one thing we found in session 2, looking at various definitions of God, various proofs for God's existence, rational proofs for God's existence, followed by statements unequivocally saying that such proofs are impossible, looking at statements that talk about God as though it were some transcendent entity beyond everything, contrasted with other statements that seem to indicate it's something that's deeply and intimately within us. Other statements that seem to describe God as a creature apart from us and apart from creation, contrasted with other sorts of perspectives that describe God in more non-dualistic terms that don't force this distinction between higher and lower, between spiritual and material, between God and creation. And finally, conceptions of God as the ultimate possessor of all attributes, contrasted with the idea of God as beyond all attributes that we can conceive, including the attribute of oneness itself. So to talk about the oneness of God is already to, in a way, limit the divine reality, because the divine reality is beyond the notion of singleness, how much more than beyond the notion of plurality. Or even taking it to the ultimate step, perhaps even ascribing the attribute of existence to such a being would be in its own way a form of limitation. If God is beyond all attributes, then surely that invisible essence is also beyond the notion of existence or non-existence, which ultimately is a feature of our physical world, which we have in many cases very precise, quantifiable tests for the existence or non-existence of a thing. So what we see in the concept of God is something which may seem a bit fuzzy to us. It may seem that it's something that you can't quite pinpoint. When you try to focus on it, it disappears and it reappears somewhere else. It's almost like the mythical particle and wave duality of quantum mechanics. You have some reality which is beyond the ability of our feeble mathematical constructs to capture in any one dimension. You can try to capture it as a wave, and it'll behave like a wave as long as you want to look at elementary particles as waves. Or you can set up an experiment to detect them as particles. And as long as you set up the experiment in that way, you're going to see particles. So just as in the case of modern physics, it's been found that the essential constituents of reality occupy a kind of mode of existence which resolves itself in accordance with how we set up our mode of observation of that existence, which seems further to imply that perhaps there's some as yet poorly understood relationship between everything that's being observed and everything that's doing the observing. Just as this is the case in modern physics, and about which so many writers have written, popular works and so forth. Fritjof Capra is one who did one of the, I think, some of the early and best work on this in the 1970s, apart from the architects of quantum theory itself in the 1910s and 20s, Schrodinger and Heisenberg and others. And so this idea of reality being multipolar, but somehow cast through the lens of human consciousness has to be reduced to one pole or another. Perhaps God is something of that, a reality of that kind of nature. And if we're going to look at mysticism and the mystical experience as some sort of relationship or drawing closer together of God and the soul, then let's perform the same kind of analysis of the human soul as we did last week of God. And what we found at the end of last week was the suspicion that there are these different kinds of language games that can be used to describe God. And the phrase language game comes out of the philosophy of 20th century philosophy. And it specifically means the kind of, that the meanings of words are context dependent, depending on the context of the usage, a particular word, a particular sentence may mean something completely different to someone else. And it seems to be with some of these highest, theological concepts of ultimate importance, such as God and the soul, that there exists multiple simultaneously valid but orthogonal frames of reference or narratives. And by orthogonal, I mean can't logically both be true at the same time, kind of like particles and waves. Orthogonal technically means at right angles to each other, but we will be looking at, especially at the end of this session into the next session, how it is and why it is that there seem to be multiple valid orthogonal frames of reference for theological concepts. So this time we're going to be looking at the soul. And we start, as we did last week, by looking at rational proofs for the soul. So people for millennia now have posited the existence of some special human reality, uniquely human reality, apart from our physical bodies, which operates independently of our physical bodies, whose existence is not dependent upon the continued existence of our physical bodies. And over the course of millennia of writing about this, a number of proofs for the existence and immortality or continuance of the human soul have arisen. And many of these that I'll be sketching for you can be found as far back as Greek philosophy, particularly the philosophy of Plato and the dialogues of Plato, where a number of these can be found. However, I will be showing you strictly from the Baha'i writings, otherwise the topic just gets way too big to contain. I will be looking at it solely through the lens of the Baha'i writings. So we'll be looking at around 10 different proofs, briefly looking at around 10 different rational proofs for the existence of the soul. We saw last week 3 different categories of proofs for God's existence, which could break down into more than 3 if you look at it in more detail. When it comes to proofs for the existence of the soul, I have found around 10 separate proofs in the Baha'i writings. And the first one is, I would say, I would call this the most important one because it's the one that Baha'u'llah himself uses in a couple of different places. Baha'u'llah is not, has not in his tablets, to my knowledge, gone through in any kind of systematic way and said the proofs of the existence of the soul are thus, and listed them out. Abdu'l-Baha has in a number of tablets and talks, but Baha'u'llah hasn't. However, in his 7 Valleys, in one of the tablets and gleanings, he talks about the existence of the dream world as a proof for the existence of the soul. So, for example, in the 7 Valleys, he said, one of the created phenomena is the dream. Behold, how many secrets have been deposited therein, how many wisdoms treasured up, how many worlds concealed. God the Most High hath placed these signs in men, so that veiled minds might not deny the mysteries of the life beyond, nor belittle that which hath been promised them. And in another of his tablets, he says, consider thy state when asleep. Verily I say, this phenomenon is the most mysterious of the signs of God amongst men, were they to ponder it in their hearts. It would be true if thou wert to contend that this same world is, as decreed by the all-glorious and almighty God, within thy proper self and is wrapped up within thee. It would equally be true to maintain that thy spirit, having transcended the limitations of sleep and having stripped itself of all earthly attachment, hath by the act of God been made to traverse a realm which lieth hidden in the innermost reality of this world. It's amazing how Baha'u'llah gives these 2 different scenarios and says they're equally true. Another example of orthogonal perspectives, whether it's all wrapped up within us or whether the spirit has been let loose from the body and is traversing the inner reality of this physical world, seems to be 2 very different ways of thinking about the nature of the soul when it's asleep. And Baha'u'llah says these 2 they're equally true ways of describing it. And I think in that equality of these 2 scenarios may be some clue or hint as to the true nature of it. A second proof given by Abdu'l-Baha in a number of places, and actually for all of these proofs, I found probably a half a dozen or more instances in the Baha'i writings, but I'm just giving usually one, since we want to get through this in a relatively short amount of time. The second proof, Abdu'l-Baha says in Promulgation of Universal Peace, he says that the changes to the body don't affect the soul, and that's a proof of the existence of the soul. He says, for example, the body of man becomes lean or fat, it is afflicted with disease, suffers malnutrition, mutilation, perhaps the eyes become blind, the ears deaf, but none of these imperfections and failings afflict or affect the spirit. The spirit of man remains in the same condition, unchanged. This is proof that death is only destruction of the body, while the spirit remains immortal, eternal. Now, we could, I think, for each one of these proofs, immediately think of a counterexample. Well, what about Alzheimer's disease? What about diseases of the body, which do seem to affect the spirit, which do seem to degrade the memory, which do seem to destroy our sense of self and our consciousness? What would Abdu'l-Baha say to those sorts of diseases? But I think what we'll find, as we found with the rational proofs for God's existence, is none of them are, unless you already believe in them, none of them will be a knockdown argument for the existence of something if you didn't previously have a conviction about it. So I'm kind of, I guess, spilling the conclusion to this a little bit early. Here's the third proof, that the soul acts independently of the body. And this could be overlap certainly that of the dream world, although this proof of Abdu'l-Baha's is not restricted to the dream world. He says it is evident that the spirit is different from the body, that the bird is different from the cage, and that the power and influence of the spirit is more pronounced without the intermediary of the body. Now, if the instrument becomes idle, its wielder continues to exist. For example, if the pen is abandoned or broken, the writer remains alive and well. If a house is destroyed, its owner lives on. This is one of the rational arguments proving the immortality of the soul. Fourth proof, that there's no effect without a cause. This is in some answer questions. He says, a rational proof for the immortality of the spirit is this, that no effect can be produced by a non-existent thing. That is, it is impossible that any effect should appear from absolute nothingness. For the effect of a thing is secondary to its existence, and that which is secondary is conditioned upon the existence of that which is primary. So here, I suppose we would include evidence for the existence of the human spirit by, say, the existence of art and music, cathedrals and beautiful architecture, and other things that seem to indicate something beyond mere utilitarian or purposes, or beyond results of the mere struggle for survival. Things like this, Abdu'l-Baha would say, is indication, evidence, maybe even proof of the existence of something beyond the mere physical. The fifth proof, beyond limitations of change and form. This one is I think, particularly obscure to me, but it's found in, again, at least a half a dozen places in Abdu'l-Baha's talks. He says, no phenomenal organism can be possessed of two forms at the same time. If an object or phenomenon presents a triangular shape, it cannot simultaneously possess the shape of a square. In order to assume any given figure or form, it must relinquish its previous shape or dimension. But the reality of man, the human spirit, is simultaneously possessed of all forms and figures without being bereft of any of them. It does not require transformation from one concept to another. Were it to be bereft of one or all figures, like the circle or the square or the hexagon, we would then say it has been transferred to another, and this would be equivalent to death. But as the human spirit possesses all the figures simultaneously, it has no transformation or death. Something about the ability to hold multiple forms in our imagination at the same time is significant for Abdu'l-Baha. The sixth proof, it is an intellectual reality that is placeless. He says the world of the kingdom is sanctified above all that can be seen by the eye or perceived by the other senses, such as hearing, smell, taste, or touch. Where then can one find in man this mind that resides in him and whose existence is beyond doubt? Were you to examine the human body with the eye, the ear, or the other senses, you would fail to find it, even though it clearly exists. The mind, therefore, has no place, although it is connected with the brain. So it is with the kingdom of God. Likewise, love has no place, but it is connected with the heart. And in the same way, the kingdom has no place, but it is connected with the human reality. It follows clearly from these explanations that man is immortal and everlasting. Seventh proof, that the part cannot possess what the whole lacks. He says, if it be claimed that the intellectual reality of man belongs to the world of nature, that it is a part of the whole, we ask, is it possible for the part to contain virtues which the whole does not possess? For instance, is it possible for the drop to contain virtues of which the aggregate body of the sea is deprived? And the implication here is that we possess the mind, we possess these powers that are unique to the human form, which other animals are deprived of. And this is, for Abdu'l-Baha, a proof of the existence of something beyond the body. He says in Paris Talks, the very existence of man's intelligence proves his immortality. And the eighth proof is the existence of consciousness. You'll notice some of these overlap with each other. And the reason I've separated them out as I have is that if you look at the source text, it's often the case that these overlapping proofs are given by Abdu'l-Baha himself as though they were separate proofs. He says again in one of his talks, when you wish to reflect upon or consider a matter, you consult something within you. Whom do you consult? Who is within you deciding this question? Surely there is a distinct power, an intelligent ego. Were it not distinct from your ego, you would not be consulting it. It is greater than the faculty of thought. It is your spirit which teaches you, which advises and decides upon matters. The ninth proof is that simple elements are eternal. And of course, the human soul being, as it is posited, a simple element, it is therefore eternal. Abdu'l-Baha gives the example of atoms. He says, when the atom entered into the composition of the tree, it died to the mineral kingdom, but throughout its traversing, it was subject to transformation and not annihilation. In the mineral realm, there was a spirit of existence. In the world of plant life and organisms, it reappeared as the vegetative spirit. Thence it attained the animal spirit and finally aspired to the human spirit. These are degrees and changes, but not obliteration. And this is a rational proof that man is everlasting, ever living. Therefore, death is only a relative term implying change. For example, we will say that this light before me, having reappeared in another incandescent lamp, has died in the one and lives in the other. This is not death in reality. This was from his talk to the Theosophical Society in Chicago. And if you look at the whole talk, he doesn't say anything about personal immortality in this talk. He talks about the human spirit as though it were a light, just like a light shining in lamps, and it may go out in one lamp, but it reappears in another lamp. And so it's the light that is eternal. It's the light that continues. And the 10th proof is the self-abnegating behavior of the prophets. So proofs 1 and 10 are, I found in Baha'u'llah's writings, and the ones in the middle are principally from Abdu'l-Baha's talks and tablets. Baha'u'llah says, wert thou to ponder in thine heart the behavior of the prophets of God, thou wouldst assuredly and readily testify that there must needs be other worlds besides this world. The majority of the truly wise and learned have throughout the ages, as it hath been recorded by the pen of glory in the tablet of wisdom, borne witness to the truth of that which the holy writ of God hath revealed. How could such souls have consented to surrender themselves unto their enemies, if they believed all the worlds of God to have been reduced to this earthly life? Would they have willingly suffered such afflictions and torments as no man hath ever experienced or witnessed? And we can note that this proof depends on one believing in the truth of the prophets. And from that, it follows that they wouldn't behave in the way that they did if there wasn't some form of continuance after death. So as I mentioned, for each of these, I should say 10, not 9, proofs, there is quite a bit of additional evidence and quite a larger number of passages from the Baha'i writings if you're interested in delving into the subject. And I'll add, just as a bonus, an 11th proof, which I found in the writings of Plato, and I didn't see a version of this in the Baha'i writings. And I think is an example of something we'll talk about right afterwards. So this is from a dialogue where Socrates is talking to a fellow named Cebes. Socrates says, let us see whether in general everything that admits of generation is generated in this way and no other. Opposites from opposites, wherever there is an opposite. As for instance, beauty is opposite to ugliness and right to wrong, and there are countless other examples. Let us consider whether it is a necessary law that everything which has an opposite is generated from that opposite and from no other source. And a little later in the dialogue, he says, now tell me in the same way, he went on, about life and death. Do you not admit that death is the opposite of life? Cebes, I do. And that they come from one another? Yes. Then what comes from the living? The dead. And what, asked Socrates, comes from the dead? I must admit, he said, that it is the living. Then our souls do exist in the next world. So it seems. This actually reminds me from the scene in Monty Python's Quest for the Holy Grail, where the wise Sir, I can't remember his name. It wasn't Sir Robin. It was one of the Knights of the Round Table is asking the peasants about prove that she's a witch, and he goes through this convoluted proof that she's a witch. One reads this and wonders, okay, what kind of wool is Socrates pulling over our eyes? You know, is this really a proof for the existence of souls in the next world? There's so many antecedent statements that you have to take as given before you're going to agree with the conclusion. It's as though logic is like a string, and the string itself is very solid, and it's inevitable if you're at one point in the string how to get to the next point in the string. What's not inevitable is where the end point of the string is, and that's the assumptions that you start with. And logic as a discipline and rational proofs in general are only valid insofar as they start with the right assumptions. Given those assumptions, logic is like that string that leads you from a set of assumptions to a set of conclusions. And those conclusions are inevitably fixed and determined by the logical steps that take you in sequence from your premises to your conclusions. And these dialogues of Socrates, I think, expose very well how a conclusion is so completely dependent upon the premises, where you can reach a conclusion that you really don't feel like it's justified. And you realize that, I think more clearly here, that the premises are the culprit. It's less clear, I think, in the proofs for the existence and immortality of the soul, perhaps, that Abdu'l-Baha gives and Baha'u'llah give in the previous section of those 10 proofs. But I suppose I would leave it as an exercise to the readers if you wanted to go through each of those 10 proofs and try to uncover what are the premises that these proofs are based on, that they could reach the conclusion of the existence and immortality of the soul. And I think similarly to our discussion last time about the logical proofs for the existence of God, in that case, we had statements by Abdu'l-Baha in some answer questions and minimizing these proofs. And actually Abdu'l-Baha's minimization of these proofs, where he says, I've adduced these proofs for the weak-minded. I can't actually recall whether he had just finished giving some proofs for God's existence or proofs for the immortality of the soul. But I imagine I would throw them kind of into the same bin in a way, that they're both realities which are truly beyond reason to establish. But nevertheless, Abdu'l-Baha goes through the exercise, and Baha'u'llah gives us these examples as proofs. Why do they do that if, as we saw the Bab in the last session say so clearly that God is beyond proof, and to try to prove God's existence is a form of is almost an unforgivable sin, because you're wrenching the divine essence into the world in order to confine it inside the box of your proof. Perhaps it has something to do with the fact that there are these two different languages, at least two different languages. I'm only really talking and focusing on these two different kinds of language games in these sessions. One that sees, let's say, through the eye of distinction, through the eye of analysis, and one that sees through the eye of unity, or the eye of synthesis. Depending on which eye or which lens you're looking at the world through, things like rational proofs can either be extremely useful or extremely irrelevant. And it all depends on what hat you're wearing when you read these things. It depends on, maybe to put it in terms of the seven valleys of Baha'u'llah, it depends on what valley you're in, what you see as proof, what matters to you, what holds meaning to you, is so much a function of where you are on the spiritual journey. So these rational proofs for God's existence are, and these rational proofs for the existence of the human soul are, in a way, undermined by the authors of those proofs themselves, or the transmitters of those proofs themselves. In the case of the soul, Baha'u'llah says regarding its ultimate ineffability, he doesn't say outright you can't prove its existence, but he says, "Thou hast asked me concerning the nature of the soul. Know verily that the soul is a sign of God, a heavenly gem, whose reality the most learned of men hath failed to grasp, and whose mystery no mind, however acute, can ever hope to unravel." This is in Gleanings, and in the next section of Gleanings, Baha'u'llah seems to, I think, to me, very suggestively put the mystery of the human soul and the mystery of God and of God's existence side by side as twin ineffable realities that human reason will never reach, and that the best we can do really is admit our powerlessness before the understanding of either one of these two. He says, having recognized thy powerlessness to attain to an adequate understanding of that reality which abideth within thee, thou wilt readily admit the futility of such efforts to fathom the mystery of the living God. This confession of helplessness, which mature contemplation must eventually impel every mind to make, is itself the acme of human understanding and marketh the culmination of man's development. So the whole business of rational proofs, whether about God or about the human soul, seems to ultimately run aground at statements such as this by Baha'u'llah, who assures us that in the end, one can only confess one's helplessness before these realities. What one is left with then, when talking about the human soul, just as with talking about God, is one can only appeal to helpful metaphors which may capture some aspect of it. Example of metaphors which we've seen already in the last session, the metaphor of the soul as a lamp or as a spark, almost like a beam of light, really. Baha'u'llah in the Hidden Word says, "Thou art my lamp and my light is in thee." And he says, "With the hands of power I made thee, and with the fingers of strength I created thee, and within thee have I placed the essence of my light." This idea of the soul as light is also in that talk by Abdu'l-Baha to the Theosophist, where he says, it may be extinguished in one lamp, but it shines in another lamp, and so it's deathless and forever and immortal. But what Abdu'l-Baha is talking about, of course, is not the lamp, the physical body, the physical temple. He's talking about the reality of the light itself, which is deathless and which continues on. Another metaphor for the soul is that of the drop. In one of his tablets, Abdu'l-Baha says, "Release yourselves from this world's life, and at every stage long ye for non-existence. For when the ray returneth to the sun, it is wiped out. And when the drop cometh to the sea, it vanisheth. And when the true lover findeth his beloved, he yieldeth up his soul." Of course, the drop vanishes when it comes to the sea, but it's not destroyed. The water of the sea that it returns to is eternal. Very closely related to the metaphor of the drop is the metaphor of the wave. In Paris Talks, Abdu'l-Baha says, "Your souls are as waves on the sea of the spirit. Although each individual is a distinct wave, the ocean is one, and all are united in God. Every heart should radiate unity so that the light of the one divine source of all may shine forth bright and luminous. We must not consider the separate waves alone, but the entire sea. We should rise from the individual to the whole. The spirit is as one great ocean, and the waves thereof are the souls of men." And elsewhere, I quoted this in the last session, and elsewhere, Abdu'l-Baha identifies the waves which are the souls of men, as the waves of the primal will. He says the primal will is that deep that calls unto deep. It's that it's the face of the waters that the Holy Spirit moved over in the first verses of the Old Testament. It's that matrix out of which all things are born. It's the divine logos, the principle of order, the word which was before all things, the word which was with God and was God, and the word that became flesh and dwelt among us in the first verses of the Gospel of John. That is ultimately the reality of things. Then is not pantheistic, but it's kind of one step down from saying that everything is like the waves of the sea, everything is like the essence of God. It's saying rather it's the waves of the primal will. But what then is this primal will? Have we created another God and set it aside our more strict, transcendent, monotheistic conception of God? What is the primal will? Baha'u'llah in his Tablet of Wisdom says the primal will is nature. It's what the scientists all along have been studying the laws of at the lowest degrees in their mathematical forms, and in higher degrees using more and more statistics, I suppose, or less mathematics, until you get to things like human beings and civilizations, and then one can try to apply mathematics to it, but it's less and less successful. But ultimately, these laws that underlie things and the principles that govern the movement of everything from atoms and stars to progress of human civilization, those laws of nature, which scientists would call, is simply the activity of the primal will, as Baha'u'llah says in his Tablet of Wisdom. And so these different ways of describing the soul, these different metaphors of the drop and the spark and the wave and so forth, all of them tend to erode the notion of separateness between the soul and God. Going back to our proposed definition of mysticism as the drawing together of the soul to God, the sort of coming, the nearness, the ever nearer approach of the soul to God. And when we ask, well, what do we really mean by God and what do we really mean by the soul? Let's try to prove their existence. Well, we can't really. Let's try to grasp something about them through the use of metaphor. It's helpful, perhaps, but what these metaphors do is they tend to suggest to us that the idea of God and the soul being these separate things that are then coming together, and that being the mystical path is the coming together of God and the soul, may be a useful way of thinking about the process from one perspective, from a dualistic perspective, from the language game of dualism, but from another perspective, a more non-dualistic perspective or monistic perspective, that inner reality that resides within us, the spark within us, is the essence of God's light. The drop that is our soul is made up of the same water of the sea that all other drops and all other waves are made up of. In other words, the dualism of subject and object, the dualism of the creature and God, the dualism of the created and the creator, through another kind of a lens, the eye of oneness as opposed to the eye of distinction, seems to and tends to think of these two things as aspects of one reality. And here we're approaching one of the most challenging aspects of the mystical path, as various mystics have discovered, some to their perhaps to their regret, as they say aloud what can't be spoken. Al-Hallaj was famously said, "An al-Haq, I am the true one, I am God," and he was killed for that. And many mystics throughout history have come to that conclusion, that I am God. And from one perspective, that's the greatest blasphemy for the creator to identify itself with, for the creation to identify itself with the creator. But seeing through the eye of oneness that is the conclusion that the mystics, whether of East or of the West or of any other part of the world, seem to come to, that the true reality, our true reality, is the divine reality. Therein lies the secret and promise of our immortality, because in the end, our light, the part of us which is immortal, is that divine light which is everywhere, as Abdu'l-Baha said to the Theosophists on May 4th in Chicago. So to try to add a little bit of evidence around this astonishing and challenging claim, I'll present a few quotations from Baha'u'llah and the Bab. The first is from the Gleanings, Gleanings number 1, actually. Baha'u'llah says, "Whatever duty thou hast prescribed unto thy servants, of extolling to the utmost thy majesty and glory, is but a token of thy grace unto them, that they may be enabled to ascend unto the station conferred upon their own inmost being, the station of the knowledge of their own selves." What is Baha'u'llah saying here? He seems to be saying that the whole purpose of prayers, which are set up to extol God in all of his glory and grandeur and transcendence and might and all of those things, is for a kind of secret or hidden purpose. And the hidden purpose is that in the end, one realizes through extolling this transcendent being outside oneself, one realizes the station of the knowledge of their own self. Somehow what was out there on the horizons becomes identified with that which is within the souls, to paraphrase a verse of the Quran. The Bab says this in particularly challenging form in a couple of different places, quoted by Nader Saidi in Gate of the Heart. In one place he says, "He who worshipeth God through anyone but him, by gazing at his own self as the worshipper, and at God as the object of his worship, hath joined partners with God and hath never worshipped him." A very simple statement which seems to subvert the very conception of prayer, which I think is commonly held by everyone certainly in the Western theological tradition, that prayer is a matter of the suppliant, the creator, the servant, coming into relationship with the creator of all. The Bab seems to be saying here that if one sees prayer in that dualistic context as a creation opposed to the creator, then one is in a way joining partners with God. What then remains of the nature of prayer? If prayer is not about a conversation with someone other than yourself, an exalted or heightened conversation with someone other than yourself, then what remains of the nature of prayer? Here, I think we're starting to reach into some of the real mystical depths of the subject of prayer, which, again, at one level, can very much accurately and usefully be described as the servant in relationship to its creator. But in passages like this and elsewhere, which, although numerically are quite a small fraction of the totality of the revelation, of the Baha'i revelation, the fact that these are in a minority of the passages describing the relationship of the soul to its creator is, I think, no necessary evidence that the truth of the things must lie elsewhere. Baha'u'llah has always said that everything he says is in proportion to the capacity and receptivity of the audience, everything that he has said. What if it's the case that his audience overwhelmingly was not ready to hear about God as ultimately being one's own inmost reality? What if what they needed was a divine reality structured after the pattern of the monotheism, of the great monotheisms of the Western world, in which God is the rule setter, the boundary maker, the one who defines what is good and bad, the one who propels human beings on the path of right action throughout their lives. This sort of outcome is perhaps a more natural outcome of the conception of God as being outside oneself, as being standing in judgment of one's actions and so forth. Perhaps therein, at least in part, lies the wisdom of the dualistic conception of God. But that wisdom is, again, orthogonal to this conception of God as ultimately identified with the worshiper. Orthogonal and I think equally true. We would probably be overstepping to say, well, this one is more true than the other, because what's more true is ultimately a function of what an individual soul is in need of. Let's look at a second example of this amazingly challenging descent into non-dualism by the Bab in another passage also quoted in Gate of the Heart. The Bab talks about the soul as, let's say, a mode of the divine remembrance. And as a little bit of context to this, which one can find if by referring to Gate of the Heart, the Bab is talking about how the divine remembrance, which we might identify with the primal will, we might identify with the logos of the Gospel of John, we could identify it even with the Holy Spirit or the inner reality of the manifestation. He says it is that self remembrance of God to God that is the generative force underlying creation. It's that, in a way, it's the completion of a circle. It's the snake swallowing its tail in the ancient symbol of the Ouroboros. It's the divine breath of the meditant who breathes in and out and thus completes a circuit over and over. And that circular motion is what helps to accentuate and deepen the meditative process. So this circular motion of the divine remembrance, remembering itself to itself, is something that the Bab, as we see, identifies with the human soul. He says, therefore, it is necessary, according to true wisdom, that the pre-existent God describe himself to his creatures, that they may recognize their creator, and that out of the grace of the pre-existent, the contingent beings may attain their supreme end. This divine self-description is itself a created thing. Whoso hath recognized it, hath recognized his Lord. This description, the divine self-description, is denoted as the soul or self. And he who hath known himself hath known his Lord. Here he's quoting a hadith of Islam. Behold with the eye of thy heart, verily thy truth, the truth of thy being, is the divinity of thy Lord revealed unto thee and through thee. Thou art he himself, and he is thou thyself. Except that indeed thou art that thou art, and he is that he is. I mean, I can't emphasize enough how strange and compelling this quotation is to me. It's as though the Bab pulls back from the brink at the very last phrase of the last sentence, maintains, okay, there is a separation in the end. But before he pulls back from the brink, he's describing a kind of mystical reality in which our soul, our self, the thing that we thought was ours, the thing that we thought was our piece of reality, our fragment of creation, actually turns out not to belong to us. It actually turns out, in the final analysis, to simply be a mode of God's remembrance of his own self. And God remembers himself through the infinite potentialities and the infinite possibilities of creation. Those are, it's the fecundity of the creative act that gives rise to this infinite universe that we live in, that possibly an infinite multiverse, we don't know, that seems to have as its goal to maximize the ways in which conscious beings can ponder their own emergence, because in doing so, they're completing that ontological circle. And in doing so, they are becoming the manifestations of that divine remembrance, which remembers itself to itself throughout all eternity. So, lest you think that only the Bab talks in this vein, you might not have noticed in one of Baha'u'llah's prayers, I think he's saying the same thing that the Bab said in that last passage. And this is in Prayers and Meditations number 78. So you might have to read this more than once, but here's how Baha'u'llah says it. He says, every time I'm reminded of thee and muse on thy virtues, I am seized with such ecstasies and am so enravished by thee that I find myself unable to make mention of thy name and to extol thee. I am carried back to such heights that I recognize myself to be the same as the remembrance of thee in thy realm and the essence of thy praise among thy servants. As long as that self endureth, so long will thy praise continue to be shed abroad among thy creatures and thy remembrance glorified by thy people. Every man endued with insight among thy servants is persuaded that myself liveth eternally and can never perish, inasmuch as remembrance of thee is eternal and will endure so long as thine own self endureth, and thy praise is everlasting and will last as long as thine own sovereignty will last. It's that bit where he says, I recognize myself to be the same as the remembrance of thee in thy realm. So what struck me is that he seems to be saying the same thing that the Bab was saying here, that this description, this divine self-description of the divine remembrance remembering itself to itself, he says, is denoted as the soul or self, and he who hath known himself hath known his Lord. So even Baha'u'llah, of course, we know Baha'u'llah in his mystical works, particularly his earlier mystical works in the Baghdad period, tend to slip into this monistic mode in which the seeker at an advanced stage of the journey realizes and recognizes his or her oneness with the source, very much in that Sufi mystical vein, and one can, I think, find almost exactly what Baha'u'llah is saying and what the Bab is saying in the works of the great Sufi mystics, Rumi, Ibn Arabi, and others, whether through poetry or more discursive texts. And one can also find these same ideas expressed, of course, very much in the Eastern practices of Vedanta, in Hinduism, Buddhism, and in Taoism, as well as in Christian mysticism, the Christian mysticism of Pseudo Dionysius and Meister Eckhart and others, as well as in certain mystical strains of Judaism, let alone in the traces that remain of native traditions of peoples elsewhere throughout the world that we don't have good historical records of. This idea of the soul and of reality ultimately reducing and boiling down in the end to a single consciousness, of which we go through our lives mostly in ignorance of, and operating under the illusion of separateness, that we are separate from others, and we're separate from our environment, and we're separate from the ground that we walk on, as well as other people that live next door, let alone people that live on other nations or around the world. All of this separateness is ultimately an illusion. And at the end of the mystical path, one finds a uniting of all through that one light of the Spirit. So that's what I had for this time. And the next time we'll be looking at these themes of dualism and non-dualism as they apply both to our notions of God and the notion of the human spirit or soul in the context of the mystical path, and look again more at this existence of multiple orthogonal languages in the Baha'i writings and elsewhere that make this subject such a challenging one to discuss. So thanks for thanks for sitting through this, and please jump in with your questions.
I've got a question regarding the passage. It was a shorter passage by the Bob, and it was something along the lines of, he who praiseth God and views himself as the servant, and God as a thing being praised, has verily never known God, something along those lines.
Yeah.
That passage is concerning to me, because I think that is kind of the attitude that I have had. So I'm curious,
Yeah.
what obviously this stuff is incredibly hard to conceptualize, but what would be kind of a better way of viewing the relationship when we praise God?
Great question. And there are different ways of thinking about prayer. And I also grew up very much thinking about prayer as, I'm trying to have a conversation with an invisible being that I've never met, but who's listening anyway, and who may or may not answer my words. And the fact that 99% of Baha'u'llah's writings are written in that mode says there's something to it. So it's not a matter of having to, reading this passage from the Bab and saying, oh, I have to toss out everything I've ever thought, everything I've ever done, it was all wrong. That's not the way I read the statement by the Bab in any case. But I do think that he's inviting us to imagine a different kind of process that goes on when we're praying, which perhaps could be thought of more as a process of inner alignment with a field that flows through all things, almost as though we're a compass and we're trying to align our inner compass with true magnetic north. And true magnetic north is out there independently of us. It's the lines of force, that everything flows towards in a way. And spiritually speaking, thinking of prayer in that sense as trying to be receptive to the current of love that's flowing through things, and to align oneself to that current and then to move in that direction, is a different way of conceptualizing prayer that's no longer a kind of subject-object conceptualization, but I think it can have the same result. It can have the same result in that it translates into action, positive action in the world. Ultimately, we know that all prayer can only be answered through action anyway. There's that famous, I think it's a Pilgrim note, but I think it's as true as any Pilgrim note. I imagine, I think it's true anyway. This is the Pilgrim note of during the time of Shoghi Effendi. Shoghi Effendi said about 7 steps of prayer, I think, and the last step was, after all the preparation and the saying of the prayer and so forth, it's to go out and act as though the prayer were already answered, and it's through actions that the prayer is answered. And that way of thinking about prayer, I think, dovetails very nicely with this more non-personal way, non-conversational way of thinking about prayer as a mode of inner alignment. It has the effect of forcing us to be aware of that which is outside ourselves, to come into closer harmony with that, to be aware of the sufferings of those around us, to be aware of how we can make our environment better. All of those things, I think, come naturally when we think about prayer as a mode of being, of opening oneself to the forces of the spirit that are circulating through everything.
Thank you.
I had a question about the nature of the soul. I don't know if you're gonna get into it more in the next sessions, but something I'm trying to understand is, well, in the writings, there are writings by Abdul Baha that he says that the soul, human spirit, is independent of the body. But at the same time, we have this non-dualistic view of like that our spirit and our soul is within the body, and that it exists within the body. So in the same sense, it seems like it cannot be independent of material world. Like the spirit cannot be independent of material, but the writings seem to say that it does live independent of the material world. And something else that adds to the confusion for me is that when I think Abdu'l-Baha talks about the spirits of animals, that they kind of disappear after they die, like they become kind of non-existent. And so it seems that it is dependent on their material existence for them, but not for humans. But yeah, I'm trying to wrap my head around these confusions. Yeah,
that's kind of two questions in one. And one, to briefly address the second one first, Abdu'l-Baha talks about spirit as a reality that exists at different levels. And he talks about a mineral spirit, a vegetable spirit, an animal spirit, a human spirit. And then beyond the human spirit, there's the Holy Spirit, and he has all these different names for it. And at the lowest levels, the level of the mineral spirit, Abdu'l-Baha calls it a mineral spirit, but what he's really talking about is the force of attraction between atoms. So at the level of the mineral spirit, what we're really talking about is gravitation, the strong and weak nuclear force, electromagnetism, the things that can be actually expressed quite well in mathematical form. That's the mineral spirit. And when it comes to the transition between the animal spirit and the human spirit, it's as though, because if the animal spirit essentially it dissolves upon the dissolution of the elements of the body, but the human spirit doesn't, then that's suggesting that there's some sort of inflection point in the creation of things where certain kinds of configurations are temporary up into a point, and then they reach a point where now they're not temporary anymore, but now they're eternal. So something emerges from the coming together of the elements that allow the human spirit to appear, that then enables some vestige of that to remain after the dissolution of the body. That seems to be what Abdu'l-Baha is saying. But perhaps that's the way he describes it from the dualistic perspective. Perhaps the monistic perspective emphasizes more the like the idea of spirit is like light that's shining and refracting everywhere. And maybe in the lamp of the human heart or the human spirit, it shines most brightly. But that light is also reflecting and refracting in every atom of existence, just to a lesser extent. And that light is, of course, the light of God's love. It's the light of God. It's the light of the primal will. It's it's that spiritual current that's flowing through all things. And whether one configuration of atoms, be it animal, vegetable, mineral, human, or whatever, dissolves at any one point in time, the light that's reflecting and refracting, and which is our true inmost spiritual reality, remains shining. It's not affected at all by any dissolution of elements. We can imagine an astrophysical event happening at any point where, say, a massive meteor comes and hits the Earth and essentially sterilizes it, or a nearby sun goes supernova, or a wandering black hole comes by. We can imagine all sorts of astrophysical events, which we know happen. We know that at least they haven't happened in our corner of the universe as far as we've been able to detect it. But we know these things happen, in which all life on a planet can be snuffed out in an instant. What if there was conscious life and intelligence on that planet? Is it not possible for that to happen somewhere in the universe, especially if the universe is filled with life? And if that does happen somewhere in the universe, what does that say about what remains? You know, if the spirits of those with consciousness on those planets somehow remain, in what way does it remain after the complete annihilation of that planet? I'm just trying to conduct a thought experiment to try to sort of push our thinking about what spirit is in a particular direction. which is, I guess, the direction of, that Abdu'l-Baha talks about in this 4th of May talk to the Theosophists of Chicago. And maybe another analogy, if the analogy of the light and the lamps is not sufficient, what about the analogy of like radio waves? So radio waves permeate the atmosphere in a way, and certain configurations of atoms, namely radio sets, are designed so that when you turn them on, they pick up those radio waves and they translate them into physical sound with the oscillation of a diaphragm, and suddenly you take something which exists in this invisible realm of electromagnetic radiation, and now it's been transferred into this more substantial realm of movement of air molecules, and you can hear the sound. Is that a good, I'll propose that as a way of thinking about the relationship between the body and the spirit, that while we're on the earth, living, active, breathing, thinking, loving, and so forth, we are like those radio sets that are translating the signal of the spirit and making it tangible. But when our bodies die, it has absolutely no effect on those radio signals. They continue on as they did before. And perhaps our bodies and our actions in this life contributed to the content of those radio signals during the time of our life, so that, you know, the things that we did produce news that's now newsworthy. You know, I'm really pushing the analogy here. And so now the radio signals and the different channels that are broadcasting things that include vestiges of the lives that we led in this world, because it had an impact, you know, like ripples on a pond. It had its influence on other things. So that when our bodies die, when our, you know, this configuration of atoms returns to dust and is no longer able to translate those signals into tangible reality, the signal remains, and some essence of us, you know, some part of our individuality remains in the, you know, in the radio signals that continue transmitting after our death. I don't know. I haven't thought that through. Maybe there's a way to, maybe that breaks down. All these analogies break down at some point or another, but that might be one helpful way of thinking about it.
Thank you.
All right, I think we're at 7:45, so we're at the stopping point for this week. Thanks again for sticking it out, and more to come 2 weeks from now. I'm looking forward to my summer plans. Hi, Anya. Looking forward to my summer plans, and I'm actually going to be out of the country for like 3 weeks in a row in July, and so I'm thinking at the moment that this series will actually only go to 7 classes instead of 10, and I'll try to compress what I had in mind into 7. And if that's absolutely impossible, then I could do more classes, but it's going to have to be after like a month-long break. So just trying to map this out basically into the beginning of the summer. But that might be a natural point to break off in any case.
Thank you, Stephen.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Stephen.
Okay. See you next time.